Welcome back to the history and culture of Bali. I'm your host Paulina, and today in episode 3, we'll talk about the White Raja of Bali, Mads Lange. Leisurely travel is a fairly new concept, probably 200 years old. And in the past, travel was with a purpose of war and conquest, or trade, or later spreading religious beliefs, which in my opinion is also glorified conquest. First Western visitors to West Indies were Portuguese, Dutch, and English traders, some of whom managed to leave their mark in the history of Bali, and I would like to dedicate this episode to one of them. Many of them were colorful individuals who sought adventure, loved exploration, and painted the first mysterious accounts of the island of Bali. Danish trader Mads Johansen Lange, who was also nicknamed as the White Raja of Bali, enjoyed an opulent playboy lifestyle on the island and aided in peace treaties with the Dutch. He died in Bali, allegedly from poisoning, and his grave in Kuta is marked with a white topless pyramid and spotted with black rocks as to resemble the markings of a Dalmatian dog. Lange was the one who brought Dalmatians to the island, and whose dogs bred freely with the local canine population, producing marked offspring mutts. Lange was born in 1807 to a family of merchants. His mother inherited a shop and a tavern, and remarried 3 times, giving birth to 11 children, mostly boys, with an exception of 1 sister. At a young and tender age of 14, some resources quote 18, but 14 sounds more dramatic, and I'm partial to drama. Lange subscribes himself to work on a ship called North. Lange, who had a reputation for being very friendly and charming, befriended the captain of the ship, John Bird, and they sailed together for many years. 9 years later, Lange returns to Denmark and pays a visit to his family and stays a while, but not for too long because the seas kept calling. Meantime, his friend Captain Bird sells his ship North, and together with Lange they purchase another ship called South. They sailed south towards China and India, with Bird as a captain, Lange as the first mate, and Lange's 3 brothers among the crew. None of the Lange brothers would ever see home again. A year later, Lange settles in Lombok, an island east of Java and Bali. At that time, rice production in Lombok was far greater than Bali, and rice was one of the best trading commodities. Also, Lombok is conveniently located along heavy traffic trade routes, Asia-Europe and Australia-Singapore. With its main port, Empenan, sheltered in a calm bay, Lombok had emerged as a thriving trade center. Lombok was ruled by 2 major political powers, 2 feuding kingdoms of competing rajas. The Raja of the larger kingdom allowed Lange to stay in trade for an annual fee. That's where Lange fortunes began to grow. The trade was extremely lucrative. He exported coffee, spice, rice, and green tobacco. He also traded in slaves. Balinese slaves were very prized in Java by the Dutch, who mistrusted the locals to work in their households. They preferred Balinese male slaves as strong and hardworking, and female slaves as good-looking and skilled in arts. One could only guess which arts the slave women were forced to perform. So who became a slave? Balinese warring kingdoms captured their enemies and sold them to slavery. Also debtors to Raja, widows, and orphans. The local Rajas controlled the lucrative slave trade, and their local power depended on it. What did the Rajas get in return? Opium. The nobility of Bali was afflicted with opium addiction, and in fact, one of the European traders to the island noted that if you want to interact with the locals, you have to visit them before noon. After noon, they take to the opium and stay in a state of drug-induced slumber. In addition to rice, slaves, and opium, Lange imported weapons and textiles. The weapons were supplied to the local warring tribes. Meantime, he made frequent trips to the neighboring islands, including Bali, where he befriended Raja Kasiman of Badung kingdom. 4 years pass, and in 1839, the political climate in Lombok changes for worse. The two feuding Lombok kingdoms engage in more frequent disputes over power and control. Balinese kingdoms of Karangasem consider Lombok their territory and installed their princess Jakorta as the ruler over the island. However, the legitimacy of the claim was constantly disputed on account of Karangasem Rajan's peculiar tendencies towards incest, cannibalism, and unusual cruelty. Also in Lombok, Lange faces strong competition from an English trader with the flamboyant name of George Peacock King. King wants to take over the island's trade. At first, King and Lange were quite chummy. Who knew that the two gentlemen who shared cigars and drinks in the evenings would later become sworn enemies? At the beginning, Mataram, who was King's protector, was on the losing side, and he desperately needed manpower to turn his luck. Raja of Mataram allied himself with the Balinese kingdom of Karangasem, who pledged between 6,000 to 8,000 soldiers to the cause. Now, these soldiers needed to be transported from Bali to Lombok. George King and Mads Lange grabbed an opportunity to transport soldiers for a fee. Lange was extremely short-sighted in his decision to quickly line his pockets and behind the back of Raja who protected him in Lombok. Lange transported soldiers for the enemy. The troops transported from Bali by King and Lange turned the tides of the war, and Raja of Mataram wins. King becomes a personal advisor to Raja of Mataram and receives the most lucrative post, which is a Shah Bandar, a position of the harbor master in charge of trade and collecting taxes. So what happened next? Puputan. Puputan is a ceremonial mass suicide of the losing side, where noble families from Balinese or Lombok royal houses end their lives in mass, preferring death to humiliation and surrender. Lange decides that although he was semi-loyal to the Raja Karangasem Lombok, plus or minus supplying troops to his enemies, he draws a line at marching with the Raja's family to their graves. So Lange, who was lost of all of his protection in Lombok and made many enemies, was only given 1 hour to depart the island. Lange hastily leaves on his schooner Venus. He forfeited his fortunes and his property and left with a debt to Chinese merchants worth 30,000 Spanish 8 real coins. Spanish currency was an equivalent of US dollar or euro at the time, for it was the most stable currency in the region. Shrewd businessman Lange will rebuild his fortune many times over. For Bali, where Lange settled next, provided to be even more lucrative in opportunity. Raja Kasiman invited Lange to resettle in Bali, and he eagerly accepted. He made his home base in the port city Kuta. Kuta is situated on the southern tip of Bali, and its shores allow access to load and unload ships on either side, west or eastern side of the peninsula, which is highly advantageous during monsoon season when the winds are unpredictable. Why Bali? Because Lange enjoyed protection from the Raja Kasiman, who also offered free trade agreement and provided cheap labor force. Labor was cheap also because Balinese economy was depressed. They recently lost the war to Java, and with it they stopped exporting slaves, which was also a source of Raja's income. Also, Asia at the time had a poor rice harvest, and he could export rice out of Bali to other Asian states. Balinese perfected rice production through sustainable harvesting and growing methods of their subak organizations, and due to their climate, they could reap up to 3 harvests a year. Lange also invested in personal relationships with Rajas. He traveled around the island on his horse, which was twice the size of local ponies. He was very knowledgeable and respectful of local customs and traditions. Lange had two wives, one Chinese and one Balinese, and a number of concubines. Polygamy was common among the ruling castes of the island. So Lange eagerly adapted when in Rome philosophy. According to some records, he was hoping to marry his Danish cousin Ida, who was 10 years his junior. He sent her frequent letters and a marriage proposal in one of them, but Ida probably didn't share his feelings and politely ignored his marriage proposal. Apparently, he had a thing for his cousins because he was also romantically involved with his second cousin Malana van Monk for the duration of 2 years. However, she had to return home and the relationship ended with tender letters to commemorate it. So, what was the political situation on Bali at the time of Lange's arrival? Bali was ruled by multiple rajas, or localized kings, of small kingdom states. The most revered and important was Dewa Agung, who held the supreme authority. The rest of rajas were jostling for Dewa's favors and influences. It was a game of complicated political intrigue, with many means to achieve goals, beginning from marriage alliances, intrigue, backstabbing, and not stopping at poisoning. At the same time, there was a consensus among the rajas that their Javanese imported Hinduism must be preserved at all costs. So they wanted minimal interaction and influence to their culture from European or Chinese traders. They preferred cultural isolation, but they also understood the importance of trade. After all, it was the source of income for rajas who controlled crops and slave trade on the island. It's estimated that at its highest peak, the rajas exported between 1 to 2,000 slaves per year from the island, many of which ended up in Batavia, the Dutch capital of Java. Rajas also adapted their crops to the trade demands. At first, they exported rice, dried meats called ting, cotton cloth, and coconut oil. However, later they adopted crops that were not traditionally grown on the island, such as green tobacco and coffee. Raja Dewa Agung's wife built housing for Chinese traders on the south of the island to welcome more trade. Singapore Chinese were expanding more trade, so it made sense to accommodate small outposts for them. So how did one set up a trade on Bali? Kuta is located in Kingdom of Badung. Therefore, many of Badung nobility were involved in the trade. Since the Rajas did not want the foreigners intervene in the island politics or internal trade, all the foreign trade were kept at the designated coastal area in Kuta, and the traders were not allowed to proceed inland on their own. Once a trader arrived on the island, he must establish a relationship with the local Raja and seek protection. To do so, Balinese women or trusted Chinese middlemen were used as intermediaries. They would take the goods or gifts to deliver to the Raja to establish the trade and protection, and they will travel with it for 2 to 3 months and then come back with either positive or negative response. Dutch set up trading posts in Kuta in 1830s and built a factorage under protection of Raja Kasiman, but it wasn't really profitable for the Dutch. At the same time, many political outcasts who formed violent local gangs resided in Kuta environs. They interfered with the trade, and Raja Kasiman, with all of his political influence, could not rein them in. One of the most powerful and influential gangs was ruled by Raja Kasiman's nephew, who was also a prince. That made the trading climate unfavorable to Dutch, and they abandoned the factory in Kuta. At the same time, Lange settled in Kuta. Raja Kasiman, his protector, was 52 years old, a stout and established individual who was ruling over Badung for the past 10 years. He was clever at manipulating royal elite, and by intrigue, poisoning, or other unsavory methods, installed himself as a Raja, although he was far down the line of succession when his father passed. Kasiman's father was feared and respected Raja, a major political force on the island, with a harem of 500 wives who successfully produced 800 sons. It was whispered that his kris, the magic powerful weapon, had such magic powers that it granted him so many male successors. However, when the great Raja died, his seat was contested by the sons in Cain and Abel fashion. Casimir was one of the later contenders, and when his brothers kept joining their dignified ancestors in afterlife, he just stayed under the radar watching them battling for power, sometimes aiding in their demise. When he finally decided to make his move for the Iron Throne, please forgive the reference because I love that show, he cemented his position by a marriage of his late brother's wife. She had two options, either burning alive at her late husband's funeral pyre or becoming a royal consort of the new Raja. She chose to live and become one of 80 wives to Raja Casimans. With respect to heirs, poor Casiman could not fill his father's shoes, or pants for that matter. As much as he tried and labored at his 80 wives, he was only able to produce one daughter. Clever businessman Lange significantly expands the factorage, which is a Dutch word for a factory, a term borrowed from Latin, and it means to do. Essentially, factorage is a compound that serves multiple trade functions. It's customs house and a trading post for the locals, warehouse, defense post, local government quarters, navigation support, and more. There was a constant trading activity with the locals bringing rice and cattle for trade and leaving with either goods or money. Lange exported coconut oil, ding ding, which is the term for dried meat, and it's a staple for seafaring diet. He also imported Chinese coins to the island, which are still used in religious artifacts and ceremonies. Balinese at the time did not have their own currency, as all the goods were bartered. Lange was one of the traders to import large quantities of Chinese coins. He set trading rates for the local coin called kepeng, the Chinese coin, and thus he had the monopoly on exchange rate. His profit on kepeng was 100%. Lange also imported gambir, an extract from a plant that was used in chewing along with the betel nut grown on the island. Betel nut chewing is comparable to tobacco or soft marijuana effects. It's mild narcotic, but the locals were addicted to it, and every man, woman, and youth in Bali were chewing betel nut or leaf. The royals and gentry could afford opium, so betel chewing was considered a low-class activity. The size of Lange factorage and his operations were impressive by any standards. Surrounded by a large stone wall, the trading compound featured living quarters for Lange family, workers, warehouses, guest rooms, where many visiting dignitaries stayed, music salons where Lange and his brothers played Danish folk music at nights, an impressive wine cellar, entertainment rooms with billiards, dining rooms. One of the Dutch noblemen, Baron van Howell, who visited Lange, a gracious and welcoming host, later described the residential style of the compound, where beauty is sacrificed for usefulness. However, he also admitted that guest rooms were very well appointed and left nothing to be desired. He also noticed a large cannon strategically positioned inside the gate and pointed at the visitors, to which he concluded that Mads Lange did not blindly entrust his fate into his protector and benefactor Raj Kasiman. Upon his arrival, Baron may have not been told that there were violent local gangs prowling Kuta environs, so the cannon at the gate was meant for them rather than distrust of the Raja. Also, let's agree here that the presence of a functioning cannon also sets the tone and gives credibility to the establishment. The factorage was always well stocked by Balinese goods ready for trade, and by goods collected by Lange on his vessels from the neighboring islands. Trade was flourishing, and Lange received the title of Shanbandar, the harbor master of Kuta. The fees he levied on anchoring vessels were very moderate, and he conducted business in very orderly and organized manner, which was noted by many visiting captains. Of course, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours formula applied to Lange's business dealings, and Lange had many backs to scratch and people to appease, beginning with his main protector, Raja Kasiman, to angry mobs of Kuta. Kasiman received many gifts of money, guns, opium, and luxury goods. Mobs received payoff in opium for relative peace for the factorage. Lange's enterprise expanded to 15 ships, sailing and trading between East, West Indies, and Europe. His brothers helped him run the factorage and captain the ships. Seafaring was a dangerous business back then. As a captain, you were at mercy of elements. Their navigational tools and maps were not as advanced, and on top of everything, you had to dodge the pirate ships who preyed on trading vessels. Two of Lange's brothers died at sea on the trading journeys, and one drowned right in front of Lange's eyes when his rowboat capsized. Because Lange invested in personal relationships and friendships with the Rajas of Bali, he was trusted and respected by the locals. He also obeyed local rules and traditions. He didn't allow Europeans to engage in inner island trade. It was strictly facilitated by Chinese merchants or Balinese noble women. When a ship came to harbor, Lange would record the request and relay it to Balinese noble women. A few days later, the women would arrive to the shores on their ponies in the entourage of their servants, bringing multitude of requested goods. Most of the times, supplies outmatched the demand. Lange would buy off what the cargo ships couldn't take and store it in his factorage. He never wanted to disappoint the locals or soil his relationship with them, and he acted as a buying agent for access. The Dutch, on the other hand, who tried to set up trade in Kuta and failed. In 1844, the Dutch made an agreement with Lange and made him their agent in Bali. Now Lange was flying Dutch flag and enjoying the Dutch protection as well. The Dutch were not interested in spreading their military resources thin all over the neighboring islands. Their main concern was maintaining a firm grip on Java and keeping English at bay. Pardon the pun here. To the Dutch, it was sufficient that Balinese and Lombok Rajas officially signed treaties recognizing Dutch authority over the islands, whatever that might mean. Meantime, Bali's northern port city of Bululang did not wish to recognize Dutch authority. The Dutch were constantly sending Batavia representatives who tried to settle Rajas with mumbo-jumbo treaties written in convoluted legal language. The Dutch insisted that their earlier signed treaties by superior Rajas should be binding and kept adding clauses to them. During one of those disputes over contract semantics and whether it was binding, a Balinese prince, Gustik Tut Jelantik, retorted, "Let the Kris decide." Kris was not a person in this context, but a ceremonial weapon. In other words, Jelantik challenged the Dutch with a force. As it was customary at the times, the Raja's subjects looted the ships stranded at its shores. In their minds, whatever washed up from the sea was a gift of gods, and fortunes were those for the taking. As it was customary at the times, the Raja's subjects looted the ships stranded at its shores. In their minds, whatever washed up from the sea was a gift of gods or fortune, and it was theirs for the taking. The Dutch was of opposite opinion and demanded retributions for the looted goods. They also didn't want to lose their faces with the British and the rest of the trading regional powers. Northern Raja of Bululang and his minister Prince Gustik Tut Jelantik did not hold the Dutch in high regard and decided not to pay the retributions to the Dutch. Gustik Tut Jelantik is celebrated by Balinese as a freedom fighter and a hero who opposed Dutch colonization of the island and died fighting. Meantime, in Batavia arrives a new governor who wants to set a tone to his policies of protecting Dutch honor and Dutch interests in the region. He is seeking punitive actions against Lange, and in 1846 dispatches the first military Dutch campaign to the island. The Dutch destroy the royal palace of Singaraja and force a signature of treaties that proclaim Dutch sovereignty over Lange. In 1848, the Dutch led a second military offensive to subdue the anti-Dutch uprising by Gelantic, who refuses to bow to the Dutch. The second campaign is ineffective for the Dutch, who were defeated and shamed. In 1849, the Dutch tried to solve the Balinese insubordination once and for all, and they shipped 12,000 soldiers to the island. The Dutch played politics with the local Rajas and tried to pit one kingdom against another. The Mataram Raja of Lombok is only happy to help and does Dutch bidding by conquering Karangasem, capturing Gustik Tut Gelantic, who poisoned himself when his defeat was imminent. When it comes to Balinese royalty, they prefer to die on their own accord rather than in the hands of their enemies. The Dutch were able to take over Lange and advanced further inland towards Deva Agung's kingdom of Kulungun, who opposed Dutch presence on the island and was a spiritual symbol of the opposition as well. Both sides positioned their armies and were ready for the final decisive battle. However, the tragedy was averted by the intervention of Lange, who informed the Dutch that Balinese forces were far more numerous and it was a losing proposition for the Dutch to engage in fighting. He suggested that the Dutch avoid defeat by signing favorable treaties in which they do not lose face and come out looking like winners. And that's how Lange made his mark on the island, was his peace brokerage between Bali and Dutch. The peace treaty Lange brokered ended a decade of bloodshed and maintained Balinese de facto independence. What's more important is both Dutch and Balinese considered the outcome of the peace treaty as a personal victory in their favor and awarded titles and honors to Lange. Raja Kasiman granted Lange one of the highest titles of High Commissioner, Angwa Besar, and Dutch King William III rewarded Lange with Knight's Cross of Order of Netherlands Lion. As a result of wars, Lange's businesses came to a rapid decline. The Dutch blockaded the waters, Balinese men were distracted with fighting instead of farming, and rice production dropped drastically. The island itself suffered from lack of resources. A number of ships that came to Kuta for trade dwindled significantly. There was an outbreak of cholera which claimed many on the island and close to Lange, including his Balinese wife, who died, and Lange mourned her while considering a return to Denmark. In 1856, Lange was invited to visit and dine with the local Raja. When returned from dinner that night, he vomited violently, exhibiting symptoms of food poisoning. There were rumors that he was poisoned either by the Rajas or the Dutch, and Lange's personal English physician suspected poisoning as well. Thus, at the age of 48, Lange departs the scene, leaving behind him a failing business. The business was taken over by Lange's brother Hans and his nephew Christian, who could not revive it. Christian lacked his uncle's business acumen. He couldn't successfully negotiate with the locals. He dissolved most of the operations and sold what he could, returning to Denmark. The factorage in Kuta was under control of Raja, who wanted to resume the operations for himself. Only a crafty Chinese merchant convinced the Raja that the business is cursed and wouldn't bring any good luck. And that's how he obtained the factorage operations for a song. Lange was survived only by 2 children, his son with a Balinese wife, whose descendants now reside in Australia and Singapore. Lange and his Chinese wife had a daughter Cecilia, who was only 7 and studying in Singapore when Lange died. She was adopted by an English family who later moved to India and who continued her education. When Cecilia returned to Singapore, she met a Sultan of Johor. Johor is a small Malaysian state, right north of Singapore. At the time, Sultan Abu Bakar was considered to be one of the wealthiest men in the world. But that was before Amazon and Google. The Sultan was smitten with Cecilia, and although she was not of pure Asian blood, he married her and made her his second wife. He later took wives number 3 and 4 as according to his status. Cecilia converted to Islam and changed her name to Zabadiah. She bore a son, Ibrahim, who continued the Sultan's dynasty, and the current Sultan of Johor is his descendant, as he also can trace his lineage to Mads Lange. This episode was sponsored by Crystal Art USA, the leading source of unique crystal awards and trophies. For ultimate tokens of recognition, please visit www.crystalartusa.com. Join me next episode as I will cover spice trade at the age of exploration and how it affected the island of Bali. Thank you for listening. Until next time.